How much input do you really get in a language class? I'm a big believer in just read it again and get a little bit more, read it again, get a little bit more. And if you really, really, really want to read it that much, you'll be willing to tolerate my learning languages shtick. You'd have to tie me up and stop me from learning languages. So, it is sufficiently warm, it is sufficiently bright, and I think we're sufficiently prepped to start talking a little bit about learning languages. Now, as a bit of background on my learning languages shtick, I'm a big believer in just keeping your interest at the very center of everything you do when you're learning a language. So for me, I find language learning intrinsically interesting. So, you'd have to tie me up and stop me from learning languages. But I know that it's not always at that high level of a priority for people. It's not even always at that high level of a priority for me. And so I've been asked a bunch of times in recent months, what's the way to learn languages for sort of the rest of us, people who don't have shelves full of grammar books? How do you fit that into your life? And so I think that's what we're going to talk about first. And I'm going to structure this as a sort of top 10 list, top 10 non-boring language learning tips. So the segment begins. If you are joining us later on in the future on YouTube, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to be talking about learning languages and how to do it in a way that is not extraordinarily boring. So if this is your kind of thing and you like what we're talking about, like, subscribe. I could tell you a story about a man who traveled to a distant land and encountered a gigantic mountain and climbed up the mountain for days. At every sort of stop, a monk said, "Turn back, it's not worth it." The man kept climbing. He kept climbing. He hit the top of the mountain, and when he got there, he found a temple, and in the temple was a bell. And what he did was he rang the bell because that was the notification bell that told him when the stream was live. So, be like the hermit. Don't be dissuaded. Click that button, and here we go. Okay, top 10. Number 10, or number 1. I don't know if it should go in ascending or descending order. Number 1, tip for learning languages. Learning in school should not be your first choice. Of course, if you find yourself in school and they offer, language classes and it fits in with everything you're doing, definitely take it. It's not going to hurt. But don't feel that you need to wait until you have a formal class to start learning something, to start learning a language. Learning languages in school has a really, really bad track record. I think we all can think of someone who's told us at one point, I took French all through school and all I can say is bonjour. And is this something that we're happy with? You spend 4 years learning something, you come out with basically nothing. How is that possible that we're okay with this sort of as a society? But it's utterly normal. And the fact that no one's shocked by this is itself kind of shocking to me. And the reason is just language learning in classrooms just doesn't tend to happen. And, it may work for some people, especially if you're the kind of person who has a shelf full of grammar books, but for most people, that time could be a lot better spent. So, and don't blame the teachers. They're operating within the set of constraints that they're operating in. There are always budget constraints, time constraints, what's just possible in a given organization. But language learning within a classroom is sort of based on an idea that a language is a subject like any other. Language is not really a subject like any other. It's not a subject like chemistry or geography, which you can just sit down and, learn as many facts as you can. And then after you've learned enough facts, you know that thing. It's not a set of facts by and large. Because if it were, you could sit down for 4 years, maybe once a day through your high school years and learn French or Spanish or German or what have you. But this doesn't seem to be the case. And so tip number 1 is don't wait for a formal institution to come along and sort of set you down the road. That's not the way. That's not the best way to spend your time. And it's permission that you don't need. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, practice does not always make perfect in language learning. And this is really kind of interesting because there are so many things in life that if you want to get better at them, you practice. You want to get better at playing the piano, you practice the piano. You want to get better at singing, you practice singing. But with language, what we're doing is not really acquiring a skill so much as growing something kind of organic in our mind. So it's like growing a plant. What does a plant need? Light, water, some nutrients in the soil. What a language needs to grow is content from the environment, which we'll call input, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And it needs what your mind comes sort of as firmware. It comes a lot, you've got stuff in your mind that's going to allow you to learn languages over time, given enough exposure. So it's not something that you have to practice necessarily, although there are aspects of it that practice will improve. But this means that you don't have to worry so much about baking in mistakes. It's just, so if you make a grammatical mistake, this is really representing the state of your mental model of the language. And you are not going to necessarily bake in an incorrect state of that mental model just by repeating something that comes out of it. So if, say, you're learning English and you haven't learned how the past tense is formed quite yet, and so instead of saying I sang, you say I singed. You're just sort of over regularizing that verb. So instead of, we have walk, walked, but we have sing, sang. But instead of that, you say sing, singed. Don't worry about that. That's not going to be something that gets baked into your model of the language. Eventually, as you hear more and more English, you will realize that the past tense of sing is sang. And so don't let it give you pause about, refusing to speak because you might accidentally make some error ingrained, because that's not, that doesn't seem to be what happens. Okay. So what was that? Was that 2? That was 2. Number 3 is input, input, input. So I alluded to this before, but really the most important thing, the biggest ingredient for learning a language, or if we want to be more precise, acquiring a language, that would be a technical distinction that you could make. Although in sort of casual speech, we can talk about learning languages. The input is language that you encounter in your environment, and what's your environment is just everything you do. So this would be language that you hear, language that you read, in conversation, watching TV, podcasts, whatever it is. And this is really the important thing. This is the sort of the crucial ingredient in language learning. And so the more of this you get, the better. And if you're going to optimize for something, just optimize for the quantity of this input. Now, it does get a little bit more intricate than that, because we have to talk about what kind of input. But as a first approximation, let's just get more input. And it's, if you think about going back to the classroom idea, how much input do you really get in a language class? Say, I'm thinking back to a class I took in undergrad. In my first year, I took Russian, and we met for 5 days a week. It was every day. It was a pretty intense class for an undergrad, an undergrad language class every day. So 5 hours a week. How much Russian did I actually encounter in that? Well, not 5 hours, because there's a substantial amount of the class in English. There's a lot of sort of, administrative stuff. So let's say, I'd say generously, we might have 3 hours of input in Russian per week. Now, there's some homework as well, primarily exercises, but, maybe we might push that up to 5 or 6. 5 or 6 hours of input per week it's something, but it's not enough to get you, fantastic results in a fairly short period of time. Let's call a year a short period of time in language learning. So if you can get beyond that, you're going to be doing great. Input, input, input. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 5. No, that was number 3. Number 4. The importance of compelling input. And so one thing that's often talked about in the sort of second language acquisition world is that input should be both comprehensible and compelling. And so comprehensible input, this is the sort of the buzzword. It's language material that is at a level that where you can understand the message, and there's still some new stuff for you in there. And compelling input is just what it sounds like, something with some intrinsic interest. So my yardstick is, would I be doing this if I weren't learning the language? If this were in English or whatever your native language is, would you be consuming this content? If not, dubious whether it's compelling. That's just the way that I cash out this concept, and it works for me. So compelling input is extremely important. There seems to be something that your mind does when it's interested in something, which allows it to stick with it. Think about something bad, like gossip. We all know gossip is bad, but you don't need willpower to gossip, to keep gossiping. You need willpower to stop gossiping. And so you're looking for stuff like that, stuff where your natural tendency is just to do it, just to consume this kind of content. So if you're into, I think I saw anime earlier. Did I see anime earlier, or did I just? All right. Well, a lot of people use anime if they're learning Japanese. This is something that they'd be watching anyway, and so it's not something that requires willpower to do. And so that's great if you're learning Japanese. Not so great if you're learning a language that doesn't have a huge sort of media industries to produce content for you. But so look for the things that where you don't need willpower. We'll talk a bit more about willpower soon. So that's the importance of compelling input. Number 5. If you have a choice between comprehensible but not compelling, and compelling but not comprehensible, choose compelling, because it's a lot easier to make compelling input comprehensible than it is to make comprehensible input compelling. And I'll give you an example. Say you were interested in an ancient language or a historical language. I'll use Old English as an example because we talked about that last week. And say you really, really, really want to read Beowulf. Okay, Beowulf is not a beginner's text in Old English. It's pretty advanced. It's uses poetic language. It's not something that you would usually start with. But if you want to do it, you can just read it, get the small amount that you can from it, read it again and get a little bit more, read it again, get a little bit more. And if you really, really, really want to read it that much, you'll be willing to tolerate doing it 10, 20 times. And so gradually over time, that text becomes comprehensible to you. And you have to sort of get there, but it's something that you'd be willing to do because it's something so compelling to you. On the flip side, comprehensible input, if you're at a fairly low level, you're limited in what would count as comprehensible input. And so you're looking at things maybe like children's stories, maybe specific texts written for learners of the language. And these things, people have made really cool ones, but by and large, I have not found them to be excessively interesting, and it's certainly not something that I would have read if it had been in English. And so how do you make that more interesting? You really can't. So if you have to prioritize something, you prioritize making the compelling input comprehensible. And there are some different ways to do that. One is just reading it over and over again, which does take a lot of dedication. But, as I said before, if it's something that you're interested in, you'll do it. Another one is using translations. So now this could be a translation from your target language into your native language. So say you wanted to read 100 Years of Solitude, read it in English first so that you know what's going on, and then read the Spanish version. Or you could take something that you like in English that's been translated into your target language. So the idea in both cases is you know the story, you have a really good background in this text. And so that's going to raise the bar in terms of comprehensibility, and it's going to make you read at a sort of higher level than you normally would be able to. And so if that gets you to something compelling, excellent. Another way you can do it if you're interested in something like nonfiction is to sort of read around the text. So you can read other, say you're reading something about, I don't know, you say you're reading about something about linguistics. Well, you could read other, linguistics textbooks in English to give you that background knowledge so that you'll understand generally what the playing field is like, what's being talked about. So that's making compelling input comprehensible. There are all sorts of different ways to do that. Those are the ones that I like to use. So that's number 5. Number 6 is willpower is not a plan. Now, maybe this says more about my own character flaws than anything else, but whenever I've said, you know what, I know that it's not that interesting, but I'll just power through it. This is the kind of talk that gets you New Year's resolutions that expire on February 14th, or 15th or 16th, that week. So they don't last long. And maybe if you're a more virtuous person than I am, you have better discipline, you can do it. I haven't found it successful, and I don't know really anyone who's found it successful. So willpower is not a plan. You have to find those things that don't need willpower. And there are plenty of things that we all do every day that require no willpower. If anything, they require willpower to stop, like the gossip example. So harness that interest. That's a superpower. If you are actually interested in something, there are a few limits to how long you'll spend on this if you're given the opportunity. And if you find that you don't have enough time to do the things you want to do, well, double dip. You want to learn a language, you want to read about geology, hey, can these two things work together? And often they can. Not always, depends on the language, depends on your ability, depends on a lot of things. But if you can make that happen, then do so. Too much willpower will burn you out every time. Absolutely. The other thing that you can do is, oftentimes we're interested in other people, right? We have friendships and relationships we want to maintain. If you can try to befriend people who speak your language, I know this is hardly groundbreaking stuff, but it can be a way of maintaining your interest, or at least allowing you to spend less time by double dipping in maintaining social relationships and learning languages. Two things that you really want to do, but you might only have time for one. Well, if those two things are in the same activities, then excellent. Okay, so that's 6. Willpower is not a plan. Number 7. This, maybe you've heard this before. Language learning is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so this means that you have to be ready for the kinds of things that happen when you're doing something over a long period of time. So we're thinking in terms of years when it comes to language learning. So what I would recommend then is know what the path is like. You should know, if you are new at language learning, that there's a sort of curve where it starts off really, really fun and exciting, and you have a ton of motivation to do it. You're improving really quickly and everything's great. And then you hit the intermediate plateau. And when you hit the intermediate plateau, it's going to become much more of a slog. And I don't think there's any way around it. You've lost the sort of, hey, this is a new thing. This is lots of fun. I'm learning something new every day. I'm better this week than I was last week. And it's so noticeable. You're going to come to times when you go for months and you don't really feel as if you're improving. You are improving, but it's not going to feel that way. And really the way it feels is so important, because you are trying to avoid having to use willpower. And so if you feel you're not getting anywhere, it ends up becoming tough. And so you have to have a plan in place to know that this is going to happen, first of all, but also to avoid needlessly squandering your interest. So don't spend your time learning on boring things. Don't, just because you bought some story doesn't mean you have to read it. Even if it's technically, yes, it would be really good for you. If it makes you kind of resent the language or resent your time spent learning the language, then don't do it. Instead, maybe do something that won't on paper progress you as much, but will be a great fun time. And a month from now, when you finish that book, you may be in a different frame of mind. You may feel like you're in a mood for a bigger challenge. So things will wax and wane, your interest levels, and this is normal. This is just part of learning languages, and how you handle it is going to have a huge impact on your success, because the temptation is always just to quit when it feels like you're not making progress. And I've certainly done it many times, although I say I never quit. I just sort of put something over here for now and start a new language. This is, if we're talking about character flaws, that's probably a big one of mine. But rather than quit, if you really want to learn one language and you're not someone who's just sort of a collector, like perhaps I might be, then just stick with it. But stick with it not through willpower, but by being smart and not doing things that make you bored and resentful of the time. Okay, so I think that's the extent of that one. It's a marathon, number 7. So know what's ahead of you, and have a plan for when things get a bit dicey. Okay, number 8. This is a tip dedicated to when things get dicey. So inevitably, yes, we're going to come to a situation where we feel not as interested in the language anymore. I don't know why. Sometimes it just feels like, am I still learning this? I'm not making progress, whatever. One thing you can do, and this seems like it wouldn't work, but it really does, is start learning a new language, not seriously, but just dabble in a new language. And you may find that even 1 hour spent learning a new language will reignite your interest or your passion for your main target language. This has happened to me several times. I originally felt guilty about it. You want to pick up another language when you're already not doing well at your target language. But actually what can happen is, if you're honest about the fact that you're just trying to reignite something, go over to another language that you've been curious about. You're going to learn something interesting about language learning by looking at the differences between this language and your main target language. You're going to be able to experience that joy of being a beginner, of knowing what that fast progress feels like, and you'll come to an appreciation of all that you've accomplished in your primary target language. And that excitement that you get when you're starting a new language it actually spreads, and it comes back, and it's kind of contagious, and it goes and reignites the passion for your main language. And at least this is what I've found, and I've talked to a lot of other people who feel the same way. So just as long as you know what you're doing, you don't think this is another gigantic project where you have to become at a very high level in this language. You may probably later, but it's a nice way to relight the flame. Okay, so that's number 8. Start a new language when you're bored. Tip number 9 is use guilt. Guilt's very powerful. And what you can do is, if you study with friends, if you have other friends that are learning the language along with you, if you stop, think of how they will feel. You wouldn't do that to them, would you? Okay, if that sort of talk occurs to you, that actually can work. I mean, maybe it's not the most healthy in the abstract sense, but if we're trying to get the job done of keeping to this language, then that can work. The guilt trip can work. And if it gets you through a 2-week period when you would have quit, but instead you don't because you don't want to disappoint people, and then, hey, guess what? That interest comes back. hey, okay, is that really wrong? So guilt is a powerful tool. Use it wisely. And study with friends. If you can't keep your promises to yourself, keep your promises to other people. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because the thing is, the interest does wax and wane over time. Who knows why? This just seems to happen. But something sparked your interest in this language in the first place. And chances are you're going to rediscover that, or something similar will come back. Languages are pretty much intrinsically interesting. And so you are going to find something relatively quickly, whether it's a song, a book, a particular person who speaks the language, a sense of duty, or of wanting to keep a heritage language alive. All of these reasons for learning a language will come back around. And so inevitably something will happen and remind you why you started learning your target language in the first place. And so I view all these little tactics as ways of kind of keeping you in the game until that happens, or maybe speeding it up a bit. Okay, so yeah, guilt, can be a good thing in careful, controlled doses. And I think we're on to number 10. And number 10 is something that I think I've hinted at before in this rant, but don't squander your interest in the language. So make sure all of your time spent in the language, or at least as much as possible, is spent doing things that don't make you resent it and don't make you don't bore you. Because if you feel bored, it's kind of the kiss of death for learning a language. It becomes this thing that you sort of have to fit in, and you notice that the thing that you used to do at the start of the morning, maybe it goes after work, and then it's right before bed. And hey, if something happens, if you schedule something in every day right before bed, by the way, there is a good chance that something will happen during the day that, I guess that didn't get done. So if you start to see that happening, know that that's basically the later in the day it gets scheduled, the lower in your priority list it tends to be. And you really want to avoid that. You really want to prevent that from happening and avoid that. So don't squander your interest in the language. View it as a really precious resource that you can keep and hold. And when you're about to read a book, make sure that's a book you actually want to read. And okay, so now is where we get to some practicalities that Lucy brings up, which is advice for learning a language where there isn't a lot of media to consume. And this is really tough. And this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. As maybe you can see, I have some Latin and Sanskrit and Old English grammars over there. So I am very interested in learning historical languages, ancient languages, languages that are no longer spoken, dead languages, however you want to call them. And this advice also somewhat applies to languages which are spoken by small populations or minorities, where there aren't media industries creating things for consumption, or maybe there aren't a lot of podcasts, or there aren't a lot of YouTubers or streamers or what have you in the language. It becomes everything is just a little bit harder because you do not have the luxury of finding comprehensible and compelling input. And so this is where we come back to that idea of, if you have to prioritize one, prioritize compelling. So if you're learning, say, an ancient language, why are you learning that? Is there some text that you want to read? Do you just like the idea of going around and speaking in Old English? Do you want to be able to, I don't know, a lot of times do you want to be able to understand the history of a language? Is that why you want to do it? So what's the goal here? And then try and tailor your material to suit that goal. So if your goal is to read a text, then, you have your work cut out for you. It's that text. So you may have that as your sort of North Star, your eventual goal. And then you want to build up to that using comprehensible input. I mean, for a language like, it all really depends on the language and the quality of the resources available for it. I'm thinking in terms of Latin, there are good graded readers that sort of prepare you for certain texts. You can get students' editions of these texts. So these things can help. But the farther you wander away from, even within ancient languages, the mainstream sort of Latin would be the number one. And then you'd have things like ancient Greek and Old English. The farther you wander away from that, the less time, money, and hours have been spent on creating stuff for students, and so it becomes more difficult. So basically, it becomes an issue of following this advice or other advice you get, but just with the difficulty mode cranked up, and the stakes have never been higher. Hi, Bulent. Oh, glad you can make it. I'm going to rehydrate. I've been talking a lot. So there we have it. 10 tips for keeping language interesting, not boring. And I think we can leave it at that unless there are any questions. I'm going to open up if there are any questions about this sort of any of these ideas that I've been bringing up. Let's go with them. These are mainly based on my personal experience and the experience of people that I've coached or studied with. It is also informed by the literature, but as a linguist, I have to say that I am not a specialist in second language acquisition. So although I have access to the literature and I have read a lot of it, I don't have the perspective necessarily that a specialist in that area would have. However, I have the ability to translate it into what my own experience has taught me. And so that's the angle I come at it from. Okay, Lucy is asking how to find a language learning community. Whew. So this is one of those ones where it really depends on the language, because some languages, major world languages, you just have so many more opportunities to find people, which can also almost be a mixed blessing. So let's think about a situation like Spanish or English or French or Mandarin. It's not necessarily that uncommon to be learning these languages. In fact, it might be very common. And so that means that there are lots of people that you can find who are learning with you, but you don't have this kind of spark of kinship. It's like you meet someone who's learning Spanish, you're learning Spanish too. Okay, great. We're both learning Spanish, but so are, however many millions of other people. Have you ever been traveling in a far off land and met someone who's from your hometown while you're there on vacation? You have an instant reason to talk to each other. You may not have a great deal to say, but this is someone that you would never likely speak to if you saw them on the street in your hometown. The fact that they're out of that normal context and there's a sort of, wow, you're learning, you're learning Tibetan too, not as common of a language to learn, and so there's a certain findability to people who are in those situations. So there's a kind of almost a sweet spot where there are languages that are somewhat studied in a kind of middle zone, not too rare, not too common. And those are actually, I find, the easiest to find other people who are studying the language, because, no one gets blasé about it. They, yeah, another person learning French. But also, there is enough of a community around that language that you could probably find some study buddies who would be motivated enough to talk to you. So that's, and then, in terms of tactics, I would use the usual internet strategies, Twitter, whatever social network, Discord. You may be able to find people on our Discord, actually. We have a language learning channel where people are super friendly and eager to chat about their tactics and strategies. And you may find some overlap to your Venn diagram of languages that you're learning and languages that they're learning. So I was in Seoul, and I overheard someone speaking in English, which was not that uncommon, but then he was saying that he was from my hometown. So that story actually did happen to me. And I said, whoa, you're from Hamilton as well. Hamilton's my hometown. And then we had a nice little chat. But I guarantee you, if I had seen this person just walking down the street in Hamilton and talking about something about Hamilton, I wouldn't have said anything. So there's that sort of weird dynamic. as the new year comes around, I'm thinking about my language learning goals and trying to limit myself. I've realized, I think this is different for everyone, but I've realized that I cannot do more than 2 active languages and 1 maintenance language. So, and the distinction I'm making there is 2 languages that I'm more or less working on and trying to improve my ability in actively. That means regular input. That means, whether it's a private tutor, whether it means I'm reading through books or consuming audio material, but I have a certain number of hours that I'm trying to reach every week in that language. Versus the maintenance language, which is something that, if I have the option to, I will look something up in that language rather than English. So for me, the maintenance language is Spanish. And I'm trying to essentially take anything where I could do it in English or Spanish, any content I could consume in either language, and do it in Spanish instead. But I don't have any kind of active language practice in terms of I'm studying vocabulary. I've got a text that I'm working through. I have a tutor I'm working with, nothing like that. And so I found my limit is 2 active and 1 maintenance. And so my active are Yiddish and Latin, and my maintenance is Spanish. But there are so many other languages. That's the tough part. So I have a few other ones on the side, sort of orbiting, that want to get back into the mix. And so maybe if my interest starts to wane in one of these, I'll pop one of those other languages in to revitalize it.